May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, that was quite a reading, wasn't it? You should see your faces looking back at me right now like, what is she going to do with that? Well, we are going to deal with that, but we're going to start someplace else first. The other night, when I was over at a friend's house, I noticed a framed painting on the wall. A painting that I had first seen when it was unframed. It's always amazing to me what a frame can do for a painting. The right frame will bring out the best in a painting, drawing your eye to subtle colors and shapes that with another frame might not be quite so obvious. It's not so much that the picture itself changes, you see. It's just that the frame helps you to see the complexity of all that is there. So it is when we speak of the law of God. Whereas one way of framing this law may lead us only to see a set of rules and regulations to be obeyed, the right frame will help us to see much more. Now, as I indicated last week, when we say that Jesus came to fulfill the law, what we mean is that Jesus came to clarify God's intent as expressed in the law. In other words, what we mean is that Jesus came to put the right frame on it, the frame that will bring clarity to what God intends, bringing more to view all of the subtleties and all of the complexities that God's law contains. The frame that Jesus puts around the particular paintings of God's law set forth in today's gospel is that there is really a big difference between knowledge of the letter of the law and the spirit of wisdom that grounds the law. He does it in a very dramatic way, a way that the rhetoric of the time was accustomed to, and that is you take something that you want people to look at and you push it to its farthest limit. You make it as dramatic as you can. You even overemphasize some points in order to kind of shake people up and to get them to look at the real impact of what they're hearing. And so that's what he's doing here. He's framing all of these laws that they are used to hearing, as we are whenever we read what's called the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. He's taking them and he's putting a frame around it that says, you say this is the painting, but I say look even deeper than that. You see, what we hear in these readings is Jesus pushing us to look beyond the external behaviors that are regulated by rules of law to the internal dynamics of the wisdom of the law. The wisdom of how God sets up relationships to work, whether these are our relationships to God, to ourselves, to others, or to all creation. And the truth is that the wisdom of the way things really work is far more demanding on our choices than any rules we could ever devise. Let's look at just how demanding this wisdom is. Today's passage focuses on relationships that are impacted by anger, such as murder, on relationships between men and women, such as divorce or adultery, as well as relationships that threaten to destroy family lives, on relationships to those with whom one does business. That's what all of these are around. And we don't really get them because we think of our own context about marriage and doing business and even murder and the arguments we have over murder or capital punishment. We tend to get all of that mixed up in this. But to really hear the wisdom behind this, we've got to go back to the cultural context of that time. And to do so, in the interest of of full disclosure, I will say that the cultural context I'm going to give you is not something I made up by myself. I looked, actually, at a commentary where they did quite some good work on this cultural context. It was done by a Roman Catholic theologian who's a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. So to get at the wisdom behind some of these hard sayings that we heard this morning in the gospel, let's take a minute to look at the cultural context. Because as the commentator points out, what Jesus is doing is he's taking aim at the scribes, the people who usually interpret the law in these passages. He's taking aim at them by reinterpreting the understanding of the law. For instance, murder. Taught very straightforwardly, don't go out and kill your neighbor to get his property. Don't go out in a fit of anger and kill your neighbor because you can't control yourself. External behaviors. But Jesus is saying, look past that. Look at the anger and the insults that could even escalate to murder. Look at how easy it is when you don't agree with someone to call them fool. Because what Jesus is saying is that the wisdom of the law isn't just about not going out and killing somebody. The wisdom of the law is that God intends us to live in relationships where we recognize our anger and we address it and we do something with it before it escalates. See, that's the wisdom of the way God intends us to live. And then he moves on to adultery and divorce. Now, here's something we need to understand about adultery in that time to really understand the wisdom that Jesus is getting at. In that time, adultery was less a result of passion than it was usually an attempt by one man to shame another. We have to remember that marriages were contracts. They were not about two people falling madly in love. Half the time, the people hadn't even seen each other until the marriage. The families had made a contract. The woman was considered a piece of property. If a man owned his wife, it was like any other belonging. If you came and stole that belonging, you had shamed the man. So adultery carried this meaning of one person in power shaming another person in power. They were very serious about this. Deuteronomy called for the death of both parties caught in adultery. But the man usually escaped death, while typically the woman's father and brothers would kill her for shaming the family. In other words, the consequences were devastating. Divorce was also disruptive in that community. Divorce took into consideration that usually the ideal marriage, as two families were trying to unite their things, the ideal marriage were between partners who were first cousins. That's what you looked for. You tried to bring the first cousins together and solidify those parts of the family. For example, Peter's mother-in-law was also his aunt. So divorce would tear apart villages and families in even a more extensive way than it does today. And since a woman depended on a man for her livelihood and had no way of taking care of herself without that, if she was divorced, she was now ashamed to her family of origin and often not taken back into that family, as well as to ashamed to the family that she had been divorced from, and therefore she was out on her own. Remember the story of Ruth? And how devastating it was just after her husband died. Well, imagine if it was divorce and the husband was still alive. So we're talking about things that really create even more anger and insult and feuding within a whole community, not just a family. Then he moves to lying. And the context here for lying, what they're talking about is the way that sellers, if you were selling goods and to someone, and you wanted to convince them that this was really a good product. I mean, remember, there was no Food and Drug Commission to put its stamp of approval on anything. You would swear, you'd never mention God's name, because of course you didn't do that, But the seller would swear by his head, by his beard, by his life, by his Jerusalem, by whatever he wanted to swear by, that this was a good product, even if he knew it wasn't. And so you had this whole system of doing business where I would try to convince you by swearing by something. What would we say today? I swear on my mother's grave or something. Have you ever heard that saying? It comes from that same thing. So the wisdom under that is, don't do all that. Either sell a good product and say, yes, this will do it, or say, no, this won't really meet your needs, but be honest about it. So you see the point here. The point here is not so much about the externals that are simply the minimum behaviors you have to sort of keep things together, but Jesus is saying it's about the internals. It's about the internal dynamics that eventually lead to behaviors that break relationships. The point is to go beyond the letter of the law to the wisdom of the law if you want to live a kingdom life. So the point is that we need to take a closer look at the anger that fuels our feuds. The point is we need to take a closer look at the insecurities and the fears that lead us to place shame and blame on one another. The point is that we need to be honest and straightforward with each other, even when it throws a wrench in our plans for getting what we want. What Jesus is saying here is God wants us to deal with our anger, to claim our own power, to respect the boundaries of our relationships, and to be gently honest with ourselves and with others. It'd be a whole lot easier just not to kill someone. It would be a whole lot easier just to refrain from committing adultery. It would be a whole lot easier just not to get divorced. It would be a whole lot easier just not to swear that something is what it isn't or isn't what it is. It would be a whole lot easier just to do just those things. It's considerably more demanding to wake up to how we deal with our anger, especially if we're not dealing with it well. It's considerably more demanding to wake up to how we deal with our own sense of powerlessness. It's considerably more demanding to wake up to how we deal with respecting our own boundaries and the boundaries of others. It's considerably more demanding to wake up to how we deal with holding on to the integrity of who we are without violating the integrity of who someone else is. If it's really true that this is what God wants from us, then we are all, every single one of us, bound to fall short at one time or another. Even if we give it our best shot. Even if we try and pray and do everything in our power to meet those internal demands, to meet what God wants from us. There are going to be times when we just don't do it. We will always have times when anger gets the best of us. We will always have times when our own sense of powerlessness leads us to shame or place blame on others. We will always have times when we cross boundaries in our relationships. And we'll always have times when we are less than completely honest with ourselves and with others. I mean, it's just a fact of life. We can say the words, we can know what we're supposed to do, and by golly, we can wake up and find ourselves doing exactly that. Now, this may be not the best thing to say in a room where there are mothers and daughters, but have you ever said, I will never catch myself doing this with my children that my mother did with me or that my father did with me, and then lo and behold, you find yourself standing in the middle of a room saying exactly the same words in exactly the same tone that you said you'd never do. I mean, it's just, it's who we are. It's who we are. We can know what it is that we're supposed to do, and still trying our best, we can't do it. So what are we to do? That's the question, isn't it? What are we to do? And the answer to that question, the answer is really just one word. And it's one word that has nothing to do with anything we can do. Has nothing to do with anything we are able to do. Because the answer lies in the word grace. The living word, capital W word, God's grace. And in the understanding that we are a work in motion. A work that God is continually working on and working with. Working where we are and with what we are and with who we are. To bring us to where and what and who we need to be. The frame that God puts around the painting of waking us up to ourselves. The frame that God puts around the painting of the wisdom of God about the way things are intended to work is always the frame of compassionate grace. Always. But that's a subject for next week.